Now we're going to take a look at a different kind of rook and pawn endgame. The last one was technical. I was winning, and I controlled the game. This one is a race, a fight, a struggle. It's a double-edged battle where both players have chances. It was played in Bermuda in 1998. My opponent was a strong, young British international master named Danny Gormali. I was white. Let's take a look at the position. First of all, I have a passed pawn, and he doesn't. An important difference. His rooks are basically defensive. Their job is to blockade my c-pawn, stop it from going. He has to also watch the a-pawn. If he loses the a5 pawn, for instance, if we were to play here rook takes f4, after rook takes a5, I'll have two very dangerous passed pawns. He can't allow that. We're going to enter the struggle in a key psychological moment. He played the move rook fc5 and offered a draw. Now, I had been pressing for a win the whole game. I had a very small advantage. He had been defending well. This position should be objectively drawn. The draw offer is a very interesting psychological moment in competition. What often happens to a player is that when he's prepared to offer a draw, in that moment that he believes that the game has actually become drawish, or even if he's just hoping that the opponent will accept the draw, there's a tendency to relax because of the offer of draw, to subconsciously give up the struggle a little bit. And this, I believe, is what happened to my opponent. He had been defending very, very well. And on the move that he offered to draw, he made an imprecise move. Playing rook fc5 tied him down to the defense too much. The correct maneuver would have been king d6 to c6, the move king d6 immediately. This way, the rook on f5 could tie me down a little bit to the defense of the f4 pawn. His king could blockade the c-pawn, and he should be able to generate a little bit of activity. After king d6, I probably would have accepted the draw. But he played rook fc5. An error. Keep this in mind when you're playing games. If you offer a draw, the game isn't over. Your opponent has to accept it. Keep the fight until the fight is over. After rook fc5, I continued with rook b8. The position is far from winning. I have a very, very small advantage due to my passed c-pawn and active rook. We'll see how it continued. Rook d7 check. Now I brought my king over. King c3. My plan is, if he attacks my pawn again, to play king b3. Then I want to play the move rook b5. If he trades rooks, then I'll have two connected passed pawns. He can't do that. Both his rooks now are tied down by my one rook. This could create an awkward tension for him. And in fact, he did play rook dc7. I played king b3. And now he played king f6. I played rook b5. And he played king f5. Now the game has gotten very exciting. For many, many moves, we've been playing a very similar kind of endgame. I've had a very small advantage, pressing, controlling the game. He's been defending very well. Then he offered me a draw. He made an imperfect move. I declined the draw offer and decided to play aggressively for the win. Now the complexion of the game has changed. Suddenly he's no longer trying to build up an impenetrable wall. He's counterattacking. I'm attacking on the queen side. He's counterattacking on the king side. Suddenly the game looks like a race. I'm going to be going with the queen side pawns. He's going to be going with the king side pawns. Now I moved back, king c3. I took advantage of the placement of his king. Of course, if his king had been on f6, then he'd have rook takes c4 check. Now his rook on c5 is pinned to the king. But this is also a pawn sacrifice. I'm playing for the win, but I've sacrificed a pawn in doing it. He played the move king takes f4. And now the race is on. I played rook takes c5, rook takes c5, and king d4. He has to go back. Rook c7. Rook c8 is the more natural-looking option. It's logical to be further away from my king, but the downside is it doesn't defend the f7 pawn, and I can play rook f2 check, takes f7. He has to watch that pawn. I played c5, he played f5. Now why don't you take some time now? Stop and calculate this position out a little bit. See who you think is going faster. Every single move is precise. Take some time. What do you think? I played c6. He began with g5. It's hard for him to support the advance of his f-pawn. For instance, after king g4, f4, f3, there's no way to support f2 because the king can't get there. He has to use another pawn, g5. King c5. My king comes into the race. h5. So now we see his plan is to play g4, h4, and g3. I played king b6, rook c8. Now I had to make a key decision. Do I want to play king b7, followed by c7 and c8? Or do I want to play king takes a5, followed by king b6 to b7? A very important decision. Stop now. Calculate. What do you think is better? I played king takes a5. King b7 was also sufficient to win, but it wasn't quite as precise. Rook f8, c7, g4. Now, first thing you have to notice is that if white tries to not allow the black rook to sacrifice itself for the pawn and play rook d2, it doesn't work, because after rook d8, black can always play rook f7, pinning the pawn and sacrificing next move. White has to play c8. Rook takes c8. Now in the game, I played king takes c8, but this would be a big blunder now, because I'm behind in the race. After h4, king b7, g3, king b6, king g4, king takes a5, f4, king b4, f3, a5, f2. Black's going to queen first. After rook c1, g2, I'm in big trouble. I can't take back with the king. So I would have to take back with the rook. Rook takes c8. Now h4. King b6. There's another variation which is interesting, and since we're analyzing, we might as well analyze deeply. I could play rook h8, which is logical, because the rule rooks belong behind passed pawns applies both to attack and defense. The best place to defend a passed pawn is also from behind. So rook h8 looks nice, but it doesn't quite work here, because after the variation h3, king b6, king f3, king takes a5, king g2, king b4, king takes pawn, a5, g3, a6, g2, and yes, rook and pawn in games can be this complicated, a7, g1, queen. We both make queens, but it looks very, very unlikely that I'll be able to get out of perpetual check. My rook and queen being in the corner cause me big problems. His queen can immediately start checking me, for instance, boom, and my king has to find a place to hide. I can't even interpose with my queen, is a very important detail, because if I do, if we trade queens, imagine them coming off the board, then black can just move over his king and then push his pawn and win my rook. The only way I could hope to win this position would be to somehow get out of the checks and then attack him with my rook and queen, but that's not going to happen. This should be a draw. So rook h8 doesn't work for that reason. King b6. g3. H takes g3, h takes g3, king takes a5, g2. Now stop. What do you think of this position? Think of all the knowledge you've accumulated in this endgame course. I want you to stop now, calculate it out. What's the evaluation of this position? I obviously have to stop him from queening. Rook g8. King f3. King b4. Black plays king f2. White to move. What do you do? Okay, the most natural idea is to push your pawn, right? Are you sure that's the right decision? Let's take a look at it. After a5, he makes a queen. You take it. King takes. Looks like white is way ahead in the race, right? a6, f4, a7, f3. We make a queen, f2. Now think back to the theory you learned in the game against Laputian. Do you remember about queen against king and pawn? The bishop pawn is drawn because of the important stalemating idea. Queen g8 check, the king moves. You slowly bring your queen into the game. You bring your queen in. And now in the critical moment, when you want to chase the king to defend the pawn in front of the pawn, and then you could bring your king, he moves to the corner, threatening to queen, and if I take his pawn, it's stalemate. So this long, long, complicated variation would end in a draw. I queen first, but because it's a bishop pawn, and he gets it to the 7th rank, it's a forced draw. That would be a very depressing end. Think about the last question I asked you, though. In this position, I asked you what your best move was. I'm sure most of you thought a5, yes. But we see that just barely, we're not in time, he gets the pawn to the 7th and it's a draw. The only way to win would be king c4, f4, king d4. Now if he makes a queen, I just take it, and after king e4, I win his pawn and then make a queen with my own. He plays f3, I attack the pawn from behind, king e4. Once again, he can't queen because I take it and then take his f-pawn. His only move is king e2. Otherwise, of course, he loses defense of the pawn. But now he's paralyzed. I play a5, and there's no way for black to make progress. If he pushes the f-pawn, I just play rook takes g2. Pinning the pawn, my next move will be rook takes, and then I make a queen and win the game. This is how hard rook and pawn endgames are. Don't be afraid to calculate. Now, I played king takes a5, prepared the second pass pawn. g4, king b6, h4, king b7, rook f8, c7, and he played g3. I made a queen, he sacrificed his rook. How do you take back? Obviously with the king, my rook is important for defense. He played king g4, preparing the f-pawn, a5, f4, if you haven't already, calculate it out for here. a6, f3, a7, f2. We both make queens, but I get the extra tempo. a8, f1. Now, I hope you looked at this position a long time ago and found the right move. What did I play? Queen e4 check is decisive. He resigned now, because after queen f4, blocking, what's the best move? I can win the queen by force. h3 check. If he plays king takes h3, I play queen takes queen. If he plays king g5, after rook check, now it's all over. He can't defend the queen. If instead he plays king h3, what did I have in mind? Queen e6 check. The only way to stop mate is to block. Queen takes f5 is checkmate. His only last attempt is to bring his king into the open board, but now it'll end very quickly. After rook c5 check, the king has to run. The queen can check. The king has to run. It's force mate now. I'm sure you can do it from here. For example, rook g5 check. The king goes to the corner. Now mate in 2. Queen g8 check. King h6. And now queen g7 or queen g6 will be checkmate. So the rook and pawn endgame moved into a race, which moved into both of us queening. Me queening a tempo ahead. I had the rook, and so I immediately was able to check and force mate. A lot of the time, when you move into a queen endgame, there's a chance for the defender to try perpetual check. But in this case, I queened first.